The overhead speaker crackled with a boarding announcement as Elijah Blackwell settled into seat 1A, the smell of freshly brewed coffee drifting from the galley. He was dressed in a charcoal hoodie, dark jeans, and scuffed sneakers, his worn leather briefcase tucked neatly beneath the seat in front of him. To anyone passing by, he looked like a man who might have wandered into the wrong section, someone whose ticket didn't quite match his surroundings. But Elijah didn't seem concerned about appearances. He never did. He simply pulled out his phone, scrolled through a spreadsheet, and waited for takeoff like any other passenger flying from New York to Chicago on a Tuesday afternoon. Then came the voice. "Excuse me, sir. This section is reserved for our first-class passengers. You'll need to head back to economy." The flight attendant, a tall woman named Amanda Prescott, spoke with the kind of clipped politeness that wasn't polite at all. She stood beside his seat with her tablet cradled against her chest, her lips pressed into a thin, practiced smile. Around them, at least 8 passengers had already lifted their phones. One traveler in seat 3B, a young woman with a live streaming app open, tilted her screen just enough to capture the interaction. The cabin, moments ago filled with the low hum of small talk and rustling newspapers, suddenly grew quiet. Elijah glanced up slowly, his expression unreadable. He held up his boarding pass without saying a word. Seat 1A first class. Amanda's eyes narrowed as she studied the paper. "That's not possible. Let me see some identification. Have you ever watched a person's world shift right before your eyes?" Because what unfolded over the next 30 minutes on Meridian Airlines Flight 812 wasn't just another viral moment. It was the beginning of a corporate reckoning that would ripple across an entire industry, one of those real-life stories that begins with humiliation and ends with history. The digital board above Gate 41 flickered. Flight 812 to Chicago. Doors closing in 29 minutes. Amanda's colleague, a younger attendant named Rebecca Lynn, drifted over from the galley with the practiced curiosity of someone smelling drama. "Everything okay here?" she asked, though her voice carried loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. Amanda answered without looking away from Elijah. "This gentleman seems to be confused about his seat assignment." Elijah remained perfectly still, seatbelt fastened, hands folded in his lap. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Ma'am, if there's confusion, it's not on my end. Please check your system." Amanda's fingers tapped across the tablet with theatrical speed. She frowned, tapped again, and shook her head with the certainty of someone who had already made up her mind long before checking. "Sir, my system shows you purchased an economy ticket. You need to gather your things and head to seat 34C." An older gentleman in seat 2A leaned across the aisle, uninvited. "Son, just take your real seat. Don't make a scene." Amanda's expression softened into approval. "Thank you, sir. Exactly. These mistakes happen when people aren't familiar with premium booking." The condescension floated through the cabin like smoke rising from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. Elijah reached into his briefcase, moving without any urgency, and placed a platinum frequent flyer card onto the tray table. 360,000 miles flown with Meridian," he said quietly. "Platinum status 7 years running." Amanda barely glanced down. "Anyone can print those cards, sir. Now please gather your belongings." Across the cabin, a passenger identified online as at Skylens Live began broadcasting. "Y'all, I'm watching a black passenger get humiliated in real time on Meridian Flight 812. This is unbelievable." Within 4 minutes, the stream had climbed past 600 viewers, and the hashtag #Meridian discrimination had begun quietly appearing in feeds across the country. Elijah, however, had not moved. He simply pulled his phone from his pocket, opened the camera app, and pressed record. His voice remained steady. "For the record, it is 2:49 p.m. Meridian Flight 812. I am being asked to leave my paid first-class seat despite presenting valid documentation." Amanda's face flushed a deep red, the kind of color that came from being caught off guard rather than embarrassed. "Sir, put the phone away. You're being disruptive." "I'm documenting," Elijah replied without looking up. His camera was steady, his tone unshaken. "There's a difference." Rebecca had already stepped away, muttering something into her radio. The static of a response crackled back moments later, followed by heavier footsteps making their way up the jet bridge. From the front galley, Captain Harold Winston emerged, a man in his late 50s with the posture of someone who had grown accustomed to being obeyed. His silver mustache was trimmed with military precision, and his 4 gold stripes gleamed under the cabin lights. He walked toward seat 1A with the slow authority of a man who assumed the situation would resolve itself simply because he had arrived. "What seems to be the problem here?" Winston asked, addressing Amanda rather than Elijah. "Passenger in the wrong seat, Captain," Amanda answered, refusing to move to economy. Winston barely turned his head toward Elijah, giving him a quick top-to-bottom glance. Hoodie, jeans, sneakers. The judgment settled onto his face in less than 2 seconds. "Sir, you've been asked politely. Now I'm asking. Please take your assigned seat in coach or we'll have to remove you from this aircraft." Elijah slowly lowered his phone but kept it recording, propping it against the seat pocket in front of him. "Captain Winston, my name is Elijah Blackwell. I'm sitting in the seat I paid for. Here is my mobile boarding pass, my government-issued identification, and my platinum frequent flyer card. I would appreciate it if any of you actually reviewed my documentation before continuing this conversation." Winston's jaw tightened. "Son, I've been flying for 22 years. I know exactly what's happening here." "What is happening here?" Elijah asked, his tone still calm, but there was steel beneath the softness now. The kind of steel that revealed itself only when necessary. Winston didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Amanda. "Call ground security, have him removed." The passenger in 3B, who had been streaming quietly, gasped loud enough to carry. Another woman across the aisle in seat 2B, a middle-aged executive in a navy blazer, set down her champagne glass and leaned forward. "Excuse me, but did any of you actually look at his boarding pass? Because I saw it." "It clearly says 1A, Amanda turned sharply. "Ma'am, please stay out of this." "I'm a paying customer," the woman replied evenly, "and I'm not comfortable watching this happen. My name is Diane Haverson, and I want it on record that I'm objecting to how this passenger is being treated." A businessman 2 rows back stood up, phone raised. "Yeah, I saw it too. She never scanned it properly. She just assumed." At Skylands Live, the stream had crossed 1,000 viewers. Comments were pouring in faster than could be read. "This is 2026 and this is still happening. Someone find out who this man is right now. That captain looks like he's about to lose his career. Meridian Airline's about to trend for all the wrong reasons." Elijah picked up his phone again, dialed a single number and pressed it to his ear. His voice was low but audible to those close by. "Yes, something's come up. Move the 4 o'clock meeting to the boardroom, full session. I'll be joining remotely if necessary and bring in legal." He paused. "Yes, that legal team." Diane's brows lifted. "So did Rebecca's." Winston pretended not to hear. "Who exactly are you calling, sir?" Elijah didn't answer. He simply ended the call and made a note on his phone, methodically typing what looked like a timestamp. Then he looked up at Winston. "Captain, I would strongly suggest that before ground security arrives, you take 30 seconds to verify who you are asking to be removed from this aircraft." Winston gave a short, mocking laugh. "And who might that be, sir?" "Someone," Elijah said quietly, "who is about to become the most expensive mistake of your career." The cabin went silent. Behind Winston, footsteps echoed up the jet bridge. 2 ground security officers were approaching, radios crackling. But something in the atmosphere had already shifted. Diane Haverson had pulled out her own phone. The businessman in row 4 was still recording. And somewhere in a boardroom in downtown Manhattan, 17 executives had just been told to remain seated. The 2 ground security officers stepped onto the aircraft with the measured pace of professionals who had seen 100 passenger disputes and knew most of them dissolved with a few calm words. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s named Officer Terrence Boyd, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who used to work in law enforcement before transitioning to airport security. Beside him walked a shorter, sharper-eyed woman named Officer Nadia Reyes, whose name badge caught the cabin light as she scanned the scene. Boyd took in everything within seconds. A well-dressed black man sitting calmly in first class, phone recording, briefcase closed neatly beside him. A red-faced flight attendant standing beside a captain whose posture had gone rigid. Half a dozen passengers with their phones raised. And a live stream still running from somewhere in row 3. "What's the situation, Captain?" Boyd asked, though his tone carried none of the automatic deference that Winston had probably expected. "Passenger in the wrong seat," Winston said quickly. "Refuses to move, being disruptive, recording the crew without permission." Boyd turned to Elijah. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Elijah handed it over without a word, along with his identification and platinum status card. Boyd took his time. Unlike Amanda, he actually looked. He compared the boarding pass to the ID. He scanned the pass with his own handheld device. He glanced at the platinum card, then at Elijah's face, then back at the boarding pass. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "This shows first class, seat 1A, Boyd said flatly, holding the pass up so his partner could see. "Paid in full. Booked 3 weeks ago through the corporate portal." "Corporate portal." Reyes repeated, her brow lifting slightly. "Corporate portal," Boyd confirmed. Amanda took a small step forward. "It's obviously fraudulent. These people know how to work the system." The words dropped into the cabin like a stone into still water. Even passengers who hadn't been paying attention turned to look. Diane Haverson lowered her phone slightly, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd just heard on tape. The businessman, too, rose back, muttered something under his breath. And Officer Boyd, who had spent 30 years watching people say things they couldn't take back, went very, very still. "Ma'am," Boyd said slowly, "I'm going to ask you to repeat what you just said, clearly for everyone here." Amanda's face paled. I didn't mean it like that. I only meant that people who don't usually fly first class sometimes try to." "Ma'am," Boyd interrupted, "I've been doing this for a long time. I know exactly what you meant." The cabin was silent except for the low hum of the auxiliary power unit. Winston shifted his weight uncomfortably, sensing for the first time that the situation was no longer under his command. Officer Reyes turned to Elijah. "Sir, we're going to need to sort this out at the gate. Would you mind stepping off the aircraft briefly, just so we can verify with the gate agent? I promise this is procedural, not accusatory." Elijah nodded. "Of course." He gathered his briefcase with the same unhurried motion he had used to sit down. As he stood, his hoodie shifted slightly at the wrist, revealing the edge of a watch that most passengers wouldn't recognize, but a few certainly did. Diane Haverson's eyes widened. It was a Patek Philippe, the kind that didn't sit in display cases because it was made only for private clients, the kind that cost more than the aircraft's engine maintenance for the year. She said nothing, but her fingers curled slightly around her armrest. Elijah's phone buzzed as he stepped into the aisle. A message flashed across the lock screen just long enough for the passenger in 3B to catch it before he tucked it away. "Boardroom ASSMBLED. Legal standing by, awaiting your signal." The passenger blinked. She glanced at the man walking calmly past her, then at Amanda still standing frozen at the front of the cabin, then back at her phone. She began typing rapidly into her stream. "Something is very, very wrong here. This man is not who they think he is." The jet bridge felt colder than the cabin, or perhaps it just felt that way to Amanda Prescott, who had followed Elijah, the 2 officers, and Captain Winston off the aircraft under the silent gaze of every first-class passenger she had ever tried to impress. The corridor echoed with their footsteps. Somewhere behind them, a passenger in row 2 whispered something that sounded like he owned something, but Amanda didn't turn around. At the gate, Senior Supervisor Vivian Marchetti was already waiting. She had received the radio call 4 minutes ago and had spent every one of those minutes preparing to shut the situation down. Vivian was 53 years old, 21 of them with Meridian Airlines, and she had climbed from ticket counter to senior supervisor through a combination of sharp elbows and an unshakable belief that she could handle any passenger issue with the correct blend of policy and pressure. She wore her Navy uniform like armor and greeted the group with a professionally neutral expression that carried the smallest edge of impatience. "Good afternoon," she said crisply. "I understand there's a boarding dispute." Officer Boyd handed her Elijah's documents without commentary. Vivian took them, examined each one, and then looked up. Her face did not change, but Elijah noticed the pause. She had seen exactly what Boyd had seen. The boarding pass was authentic. The ID matched. The status card was valid. There was no dispute to resolve because there had never been one. Yet Vivian, being Vivian, decided to escalate anyway. "Mr. Blackwell, these documents appear to be in order. However, given the concerns raised by the flight crew regarding your behavior on board, I believe the most appropriate course of action is to rebook you into a coach seat for this flight, or on a later departure if you prefer." Elijah's expression did not shift. "What behavior are you referring to, Ms. Marchetti? You were reportedly uncooperative with the flight attendants." "I was seated, buckled, silent. I answered their questions when they asked. I provided every document requested. Which portion of that behavior was uncooperative?" Vivian's smile tightened. "Sir, arguing with me will not help resolve this situation. You have two options: coach on this flight or a later flight in first class." "Neither," Elijah said calmly, "because I already paid for the seat I was sitting in. I would like to speak with your district manager, please." Vivian laughed lightly, the kind of laugh that carried more warning than humor. "Sir, I am the senior supervisor on duty at this terminal. I have full authority in this matter. If you have a complaint, you may file it online like everyone else." By now the terminal had begun to notice. Passengers from Flight 812 had spilled off the aircraft in curiosity, joined by travelers from neighboring gates who had heard something was happening. Phones were up everywhere. A teenage girl leaning against a pillar had already begun her own TikTok stream, narrating in a whisper. The @SkyLens live broadcaster had followed the group off the plane and was now positioned near a support column with a clear line of sight, viewer count climbing past 2,000. Diane Haverson had also disembarked, her arms crossed, watching every exchange with a lawyer's attentiveness. So had the businessman from row 4, who was quietly recording on his phone with the composed patience of someone who understood he was witnessing something rare. Elijah checked his watch. Vivian noticed, and even from 6 feet away, she recognized what she was looking at. Her stomach performed a small, unfamiliar drop. "Ms. Marchetti," Elijah said gently, "I understand you believe you have full authority in this matter, but I would like to give you the opportunity to escalate this before I do." "Before you do what, Mr. Blackwell?" Vivian's tone attempted to reassert control. Elijah reached into the inside pocket of his hoodie and withdrew a slim leather card holder. He selected one card with the precise care of a man who had done this exactly enough times in his life to make it feel routine. He offered it to her with 2 fingers. She took it. She looked down. Her expression collapsed in real time. The card was matte black with silver embossed lettering. Simple, understated, expensive. Vivian's eyes moved across the words twice before her brain accepted what they said. Elijah Blackwell, founder and chief executive officer, Blackwell Global Holdings below the name, in smaller silver script, ran a single line that made her fingers go cold. Majority stakeholder, Meridian Airways Partner Consortium. Vivian's mouth opened slightly. It stayed open. She looked up at Elijah, then back at the card, then at Captain Winston, who had inched close enough to read over her shoulder and had turned the color of drywall. Diane Haverson caught a glimpse of the card as Vivian's hand trembled. She murmured something under her breath and immediately pulled out her phone, typing furiously into a search bar. A businessman near the terminal window had done the same thing. Within seconds, murmurs began rippling through the terminal like a chemical reaction. "Blackwell Global, that's the fund. He's the fund. That's the guy who bought out the Airline consortium last year. He's on the Forbes list. He's on the top 100. At SkyLens Live, the streamer was practically shaking. Y'all, I need everyone to listen to me right now. This man is not a random passenger. His name is Elijah Blackwell, Blackwell Global Holdings. Look him up. Look him up. This airline just made the biggest mistake of the decade." The chat exploded. The viewer count crossed 3,000 and kept climbing. Vivian Marchetti's hands, which had held authority for 21 years, could not remember how to move. "Mr. Blackwell," she managed, her voice cracking slightly. I need a moment to." "Take all the time you need," Elijah replied gently. There was no cruelty in his voice, no triumph, only patience. "But I would suggest checking your phone in approximately 90 seconds. I believe you'll receive a call from your headquarters." "How would headquarters know?" Vivian asked, though the question came out weaker than she intended. Elijah tilted his head just slightly. "Because I told them." Captain Winston stepped back involuntarily. Amanda Prescott looked as if someone had removed the air from her lungs. Officer Boyd, quietly to Elijah's left, allowed himself one small, professional nod, the kind of acknowledgement that said, "I saw everything, and I will remember everything." Elijah continued, his voice carrying easily through the growing crowd. "I want to be clear with all of you. This is not about revenge. I have no interest in humiliating any individual today. But there is a difference between an individual mistake and a systemic failure. What happened on that aircraft was not one person's misjudgment. It was a chain of decisions made by multiple trained professionals, all pointing in the same direction. And that direction was determined the moment I sat down in seat 1A wearing a hoodie." Diane Haverson lowered her phone. She had stopped filming. She was simply listening now. "There are people watching this right now," Elijah went on, gesturing gently to the phones aimed in his direction, "who have been treated exactly like I was treated today. Some of them on this very airline. Most of them without a corporate title to fall back on. Most of them without a boardroom on standby. Most of them just walked off the plane, filed a complaint that went nowhere, and told themselves it wasn't worth the fight." A woman near the back of the crowd wiped her eye quickly and pretended she hadn't. "Today," Elijah said, "is going to be different, not because of who I am, but because of what I intend to do with the position I have." Vivian's phone rang. The sound cut through the terminal like a fire alarm. She looked down. Her screen displayed a name she had only ever seen in company-wide memos. "Incoming call. Margaretellison." CEO Vivian's hand shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. She looked up at Elijah, uncertain. "Answer it," he said calmly. "And please put it on speaker. I think everyone here deserves to hear this conversation." Vivian's thumb hovered over the screen for what felt like an eternity before she finally pressed accept. The speaker crackled to life, and the voice that emerged was sharp, controlled, and unmistakably tense. Margaret Ellison had been CEO of Meridian Airlines for 6 years, and in that time she had navigated fuel crises, pilot strikes, and one very public engine incident over the Atlantic. But the tone in her voice right now was one Vivian had never heard before. "Vivian, is Mr. Blackwell with you?" "Yes, ma'am," Vivian whispered. "He's here. Standing right in front of me. Put him on, immediately." Elijah stepped forward without hurry. "Hello, Margaret." "Elijah." The relief in her voice was audible, followed almost instantly by dread. "I am currently sitting in an emergency board session that began 9 minutes ago. Please tell me the reports coming out of that terminal are exaggerated." "They are not," Elijah replied. "I was removed from my paid first-class seat. My documentation was dismissed. My status card was mocked. My boarding pass was called fraudulent. And when I asked to speak with a supervisor, I was threatened with removal from the airport." A long silence. Then, quietly, "Jesus Christ." The crowd around them held its breath. The At Sky Lens live stream had crossed 6,000 viewers. 3 separate news outlets had begun monitoring the hashtag Meridian discrimination, which was now the 4th highest trending topic in North America. "Margaret," Elijah said calmly, "you're aware of Section 14, subsection C of the Partnership Consortium Agreement." Another pause. Then, the Stakeholder Integrity Clause. "Correct. Discriminatory conduct by employees against passengers is not a customer service issue. It is a governance issue. Which means, as of 32 minutes ago, we are no longer in a customer complaint scenario. We are in a shareholder review scenario." Vivian closed her eyes. Amanda leaned against the wall behind her. Captain Winston stared at the floor as if he could sink through it. "Elijah, I am authorizing whatever intervention you deem necessary. Full executive latitude. The board is unanimous on this." "What do you need?" "I need 3 things," Elijah replied. "But before I list them, I want you and the board to hear something." He turned toward the crowd, toward Vivian, toward the phone still recording, toward Captain Winston, whose stripes suddenly looked smaller than they had 30 minutes ago. "I want everyone here and everyone watching to understand that what I'm about to request is not being requested because it happened to me. It is being requested because it happens to thousands of passengers every year on this airline and others, and they don't have the standing to demand accountability. So we are going to use my standing to build a system that protects theirs." The crowd, which had been murmuring, went absolutely still. "First," Elijah said, "I want an independent external review of the past 24 months of discrimination complaints filed against Meridian Airlines, conducted by a firm chosen jointly by our foundation and your general counsel. Second, I want a mandatory bias recognition curriculum developed for every customer-facing employee, deployed within 60 days. And third, I want an anonymous third-party managed reporting system for both passengers and employees, launched within 90 days. Margaret's voice was firm. "Approved, all 3. Elijah nodded, though she couldn't see him. "There is also a 4th item, Margaret, and this one is not a request. Go ahead. Executive compensation, starting with yours, will be tied to measurable diversity and equal treatment outcomes. 20% of annual bonuses. Publicly reported, independently audited, reviewed quarterly." A silence. Then quietly, "Agreed." Around Vivian, board-level authority was being restructured in real time in a public terminal in front of thousands of live viewers. Diane Haverson slowly lowered her phone. She had witnessed board negotiations. She had participated in them. But she had never seen one conducted like this, in the middle of the very failure it was meant to correct. Elijah continued, "Regarding the individuals involved today, I'm not asking for automatic termination. I'm asking for due process, an internal investigation conducted fairly with consequences determined by findings rather than by pressure. That includes me. I want no personal influence over the outcome." Margaret exhaled audibly. "Understood." Elijah ended the call and handed the phone back to Vivian, who accepted it with the trembling gratitude of someone who had just been spared something she couldn't yet name. Around them, the terminal had transformed into an amphitheater. Passengers who had never been on Flight 812 stood 10 deep behind those who had. Airport staff who had wandered over on their breaks had stopped pretending they weren't watching. Even the barista from the coffee kiosk 2 gates down had stepped out from behind her counter, wiping her hands slowly on her apron. Elijah turned to face them. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I want to say something to everyone who is watching this in person and everyone watching from home. What happened here today was not a spectacle. It was not entertainment. It was a small, ordinary moment of humiliation that plays out somewhere in this country every single day. The only difference between today and every other day is that today someone happened to have the resources to interrupt the pattern. That is not justice, that is luck, and luck is not a system." The crowd was quiet. A young man near the back had his phone pressed to his chest, having forgotten he was even filming. "So if you are watching this and something similar has happened to you, I want you to know 2 things. First, it was not your imagination. Second, your story matters, even if no one was recording it, especially if no one was recording it." Diane Haverson pressed her lips together tightly and looked away toward the terminal window. "Meridian Airlines will now begin the process of building a system that treats every passenger the same way it would treat me, not because I demanded it as an individual, but because a system that only works for people in expensive watches is not a system worth having." He paused. Then softly, "Thank you for listening." For a long moment nothing happened, and then slowly the applause began. It started with Diane, quiet and steady. It was joined by Officer Boyd, who did not applaud lightly. Then by the businessman in row 4, then by the teenage girl with the tick-tock stream, then by strangers who had wandered in from other gates and now had tears in their eyes for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. The sound built into something that filled the terminal completely. Vivian Marchetti did not applaud. She was still holding her phone, her face pale, her eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance. Captain Winston had removed his hat and was holding it in both hands, staring at the floor. Amanda Prescott had begun to cry silently, and no one comforted her, but no one mocked her either. She was going to have to live with today for a very long time, and no punishment anyone could design would exceed the punishment she was already administering to herself. Elijah turned to Officer Boyd and extended his hand. "Thank you, officer. You handled that with professionalism I won't forget." Boyd shook the offered hand firmly. "Sir, I've been doing this job a long time. Most people in your position today would have made this personal. You didn't. That means something to me." "It means something to me too," Elijah replied quietly. He turned then and looked toward the jet bridge where Flight 812 still sat, doors open, waiting. The gate agent, a young woman named Priya Vasquez, stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Blackwell, the flight, it's been held. If you'd still like to board, seat 1A is available." Elijah smiled for the first time that afternoon. It was a small smile, tired but genuine. "Thank you, Priya, I would." As he walked toward the jet bridge, Diane Haverson fell into step beside him. She did not introduce herself, though she suspected he already knew who she was. She simply walked with him for a few paces, then said quietly, "I've been on a lot of boards, Mr. Blackwell. I've never seen anything handled the way you handled this." Elijah nodded once. "The trick," he said, "is deciding what you want before you get angry." The cabin of Flight 812 felt different when Elijah stepped back on. The passengers who had witnessed the original incident were still in their seats, but the air itself had changed, as though the aircraft had exhaled after holding its breath for 45 minutes. Rebecca Lynn stood near the front galley with the visible discomfort of someone who had spent the last half hour trying to disappear. Amanda Prescott was no longer on board. Captain Winston had been quietly relieved by a substitute captain named David Reyna, a stocky man in his late 40s who greeted Elijah with a firm handshake and a simple sentence. "Mr. Blackwell, whatever you need on this flight, you tell me directly. My apologies for what happened." Elijah nodded. "Thank you, Captain. Let's just get everyone to Chicago." He settled back into seat 1A. The passenger in 3B, who had streamed the original incident and had now become something of a minor internet celebrity herself, leaned across the aisle. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm Chantal, by the way. I just want to say I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." "Chantal," he replied gently, "you did speak up. You recorded, you broadcast, you made sure no one could pretend it didn't happen. That is speaking up." She smiled through slightly watery eyes and nodded, then quietly turned back to her window. The flight pushed back from the gate, 58 minutes late. Somewhere over Pennsylvania, Elijah opened his laptop and began drafting the first internal memo of what would become known within Meridian Airlines as the Blackwell Framework. He worked steadily, methodically, sipping black coffee and stopping only once when a young flight attendant named Marcus, no relation, brought him a warm ceramic bowl of soup and said quietly, "It's on me, sir, not the airline." Elijah looked up. "Thank you, Marcus. That means a great deal." By the time the aircraft touched down at O'Hare, the story had eclipsed anything anyone had anticipated. The At Sky Lens live broadcast had crossed 41,000 viewers. Major news outlets had picked up the story, and 3 cable networks were already running the footage with lower third graphics reading discrimination at 35,000 feet. Meridian Airline stock had dropped 4.1% by market close, but something more important had also happened. The airline had, in a rare and unprecedented move, released a statement within 2 hours of the incident acknowledging fault, outlining committed reforms, and identifying specific timelines. Analysts on the evening business shows called it the fastest and most direct corporate accountability response of the decade. One commentator, a former airline executive, simply shook his head on air and said, "This is not damage control. This is transformation. There is a difference." In the weeks that followed, the ripple effect became impossible to ignore. 3 competing airlines announced independent reviews of their own discrimination complaint records. 2 hotel chains reached out to the Blackwell Foundation, requesting consultation on similar systems. A junior senator from Illinois publicly cited the Meridian incident, when introducing new federal legislation requiring airlines to publish quarterly reports on complaint categories and resolution rates. The bill was nicknamed on cable news as the Blackwell Bill, a name Elijah quietly declined to endorse. Amanda Prescott's investigation concluded with her termination, but it did not end there. To the surprise of many, she reached out to the Blackwell Foundation 4 months later through a written letter, asking whether there was any way she could contribute to the very training programs she had once needed. After careful review, the foundation invited her to speak, anonymously at first, at internal corporate workshops. Her testimony, delivered with genuine humility and painful honesty, became one of the most requested modules in the curriculum. Captain Winston retired quietly. His pension was preserved. His silence in interviews was respected. In private, however, he wrote a letter to Elijah that Elijah kept in a locked drawer in his office. Its contents were never shared publicly, but a member of Elijah's staff who once glimpsed the letter said only, "It was the letter of a man who finally understood what he had done." Vivian Marchetti requested a demotion. It was granted. She now trained new supervisors. 6 months after Flight 812, Elijah Blackwell stood on the 23rd floor of the Blackwell Global Holdings Tower in Manhattan, watching a light snow fall against the windows. His assistant, Renata Ochoa, had just placed a stack of folders on his desk, each one containing a quarterly progress report from a different institution. Airlines, hotel groups, a regional railway, 2 hospital networks, a university system. Each of them had, in the months following the incident, either voluntarily adopted or been influenced into adopting some version of what the media had begun calling the Meridian model. Renata paused in the doorway. "Sir, the numbers came in from the third-party auditor this morning. Would you like the summary now or later?" "Now, please," she read from a slim tablet. Discrimination complaints at Meridian Airlines are down 68% year-over-year. Employee-initiated bias reports are up 412%, which the auditors are describing as a healthy indicator, not a concerning one. Customer satisfaction across all cabin classes is up 19 points. Passenger recovery rates after service failures are up 31%. And most notably, sir, the airline has seen a 9% increase in first-time bookings from demographic groups that were historically underrepresented in their frequent flyer base. Elijah nodded slowly, still watching the snow. And industry-wide, across the airlines that voluntarily adopted parallel systems, aggregate discrimination complaints are down 43%. The Department of Transportation is drafting federal guidance modeled on the framework. 2 international carriers have inquired about licensing the training curriculum. Have we approved licensing? The Foundation Board approved it last week. All licensing revenue is routed directly into scholarships for aviation careers in underrepresented communities. Elijah turned from the window. Good. He walked to his desk and sat down. Among the folders was one that did not belong to a corporate partner. It was thinner than the others, and its label read simply Personal Correspondence, Selected. Renata had begun curating letters for him because the volume had become impossible to manage. Elijah opened the folder and pulled out 3 at random. The first was from a nurse in Atlanta who had been mistreated at a hotel check-in and had used the anonymous reporting model, adapted by her employer to escalate her complaint. Her incident had resulted in system-wide retraining at the property. She wrote to thank Elijah, but she also wrote to say something else. "Before your story, I would have gone home and cried. After your story, I went home and filed." That is a different kind of ending. The second letter was from a father in Baltimore whose teenage son had been followed by security in a department store. The father had used the framework's principles, documentation, escalation, and systemic focus to negotiate with the store's regional office. The result had been a public policy change and a scholarship for his son's college fund. "I didn't want revenge," the father wrote. "I wanted my son to know the world could still be moved." The third letter was shorter than the others. It was from a young woman named Angela Marston, whom Elijah did not know personally but whose name he recognized from an early class action filing. "Mr. Blackwell, I was on a different airline last year. What happened to you happened to me. I was told to move. I moved. I did not fight. I have thought about that flight almost every day since. When I saw what you did on Flight 812, I sat down at my kitchen table and cried, and then I called a lawyer. Our filing was accepted last month. 31 other passengers are attached to it. I am not writing to thank you. I am writing to tell you that I understand now what you meant when you said luck is not a system. I am building one. Angela." Elijah set the letter down. He sat quietly for a long moment, the snow drifting past the window behind him, the city humming softly below. Then he picked up his phone and dialed Renata. "Renata, please add Angela Marston to my personal calendar. I would like to meet her." 2 years after Flight 812, Elijah Blackwell stood at the podium of a small, packed auditorium at Howard University in Washington, D.C. The event was not televised. There were no cameras from major networks, no live streams with follower counts climbing into the tens of thousands. It was a modest gathering of about 300 people, mostly students, mostly first generation, mostly the kind of young people who would one day sit in boardrooms and cockpits and courtrooms and hospital wards, deciding how the next generation would be treated. Angela Marston sat in the front row. She was no longer the young woman who had written the letter that had, in its own quiet way, redirected the course of Elijah's foundation work. She was now the executive director of the Equal Passage Institute, a nonprofit organization she had founded with initial seed funding from Blackwell Global and subsequent independent support from a coalition of donors who had asked to remain anonymous. Her institute had, in 18 months, helped facilitate documentation and legal support for over 400 discrimination cases across transportation, hospitality, retail, and healthcare. She wore a simple navy dress and a small silver pin on her lapel that read "Luck is not a system." Elijah adjusted the microphone. He was wearing, deliberately, the same charcoal hoodie he had worn on Flight 812. It had become something of a personal tradition. Not a costume, not a statement, simply a reminder to himself that dignity had never had a dress code and never should. "When I was removed from my seat 2 years ago," he began, "I was not the person who suffered most that day. I want to say that plainly. There were people watching that live stream who had been treated the same way 100 times before. There were people in the terminal who had endured worse and had said nothing because they had no one to call. My humiliation lasted 45 minutes. Theirs had lasted a lifetime. The room was still. So when people ask me what the lesson of Flight 812 is, I want to correct the question. The lesson is not that a wealthy man was mistreated and used his resources to fix it. That is not a lesson. That is a coincidence. The lesson is that the systems that mistreated me were the same systems that had been mistreating others for decades, and those systems were never going to fix themselves. They had to be interrupted." He paused, looked out over the room. "Every person in this auditorium will, at some point in your life, be in a position to interrupt something. Maybe you will be the one being mistreated. Maybe you will be the one witnessing it. Maybe you will be the one designing the policy that either enables it or ends it. Whatever role you find yourself in, I want you to remember this. The interruption does not require a boardroom. It does not require a stock portfolio. It does not require a card in your pocket that changes the color of someone's face when they read it. The interruption requires only that you refuse to accept the ordinary version of what is happening in front of you." He looked directly at Angela. "Some of the most important work being done right now in this country is being done by people who were once told to move to the back. They did not accept that instruction as the end of their story. They accepted it as the beginning." Angela smiled quietly. She did not need to speak. Elijah stepped back from the podium. "So here is my closing request. If you take nothing else from tonight, take this. When you see it happening, whatever it is, do not wait for someone with a title. Do not wait for someone with a platform. Do not wait for someone with a hoodie and a boardroom on standby. Be the person who documents it. Be the person who reports it. Be the person who tells the story so clearly that the system cannot pretend it did not happen. He looked out at the crowd one more time, because luck is not a system, but you can be. The applause began slowly and then rose again, and did not stop for a long time. Thank you for following this story through all. If you enjoyed this narrative and would like me to continue with additional stories, alternate endings, just let me know. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more real-life inspired narratives. Peace.